Well, I'll start off by saying that Janelle and I have three children, and each one of those children has been brought up in the wild. They understand the land, they understand wildlife, they understand the habitat, and all are accomplished hunters in their own right. Uh, Chris, our oldest boy, serves today as one of the trustees of the Caesar Kleberg Foundation, which uh, has three trustees. And the Caesars Foundation has Chris Kleberg, Jay Kleberg, and myself as trustees on that foundation. And most of the work that that foundation does is through the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute or in South Texas area, because that's where Caesar was interested in. Jay Kleberg, who ran for state land commissioner and lost, went on and studied conservation and now works for the Gulf of Mexico Trust. And that trust is a group of scientists and people that are interested in the health of the bays, all the way from Bay City all the way down to Boca Chica in the very extreme near Brownsville. And they're interested in the health of the bays and in the estuaries that are there. And so they've got the Oyster Commission, they've got the Hart Research Institute, which primarily studies Baffin Bay, Nueces Bay, and Gulf of Mexico. So they've got the Coastal Conservation Society. They've got a number of scientific groups that have studied the bays and the Gulf, and Jay is pulling all of them together under one umbrella to try to do better work for the Gulf and the bays. Desal is a perfect example. Corpus Christi has been talking about a desal plant for 10 years. The Port of Corpus Christi has been talking about it. The city of Corpus has been talking about it. What they failed to do was those two organizations failed to get the science to do the research to support the project. And that's one of the things Jay Kleberg has done. He's bringing the scientists in and said, okay, if we put the port in this location, there's going to be discharge. How is that going to affect the marine life in that area? And is that the best thing to do? One group would say the discharge in the bays won't have any effect. Another group would tell you that the best place to take it is offshore. Take it out in the Gulf of Mexico where it won't have a big plume and it won't affect the body of water and the sea life that's there. But the science is being brought together now in that Gulf of Mexico trust to argue the good and the bad about each one of those concepts. So Jay is fully vested in conservation and loves the work. We'll go back and, Caesar lived a kind of solitary life, and his palate was the outdoors. And he looked at the wildlife as kind of the measure of the health of the country. And when he came in 1900, he realized that there were not the abundance of wildlife that should be based on the environment that he's dealing with. Today, I think he would look at the barometer of the wildlife as having been successful. The numbers have expanded, but I think his vision today was probably to look at the health of the earth. And I think the grasses, the native grasses, some of the introduced grasses have been beneficial to wildlife. I think all of the forbs or the weeds that we see out there, he would see them as a natural food for the deer, the turkey, and the quail. And he would look at the quail much like the canary in the coal mine. If the quail is healthy, then all of the other species will be healthy. The cattle will be happy, the deer are happy, the turkey are happy, because the quail is on the bottom of the food chain, and it requires the small bugs, the small plants, the small seeds to exist. And without the earth providing those seeds and those plants for the quail, they wouldn't exist. And you look at an area from Corpus Christi to Hebronville to Laredo, Texas, that is where the majority of the bobwhite quail in the state exists. There are other pockets. There are pockets in West Texas that produce the bobwhite, the scale quail, and the Mearns quail, but not like South Texas. You look at the Shackelford County, Albany, Abilene area, that's another area that has quail. But again, not in the abundance that we have in South Texas, because they lack the food supply to keep them in existence. San Angelo, another area that has quail. But they're kind of on the edge of the rainfall area. They get 18 inches of rainfall. We get 26, 28 inches of rainfall. And that's critical in this sand sheet that supply the food for the bobwhite quail and the wildlife that we have here. All right, when Caesar came in 1900, the railroad came through in 1904. And during that period, 1900, 1904, there was no regulation on hunting of wildlife. Ducks, geese, turkey, deer, quail, no regulation. And Caesar saw that that was a necessary part of wildlife conservation, was to have some type of regulation on the amount of game to be harvested. He served on the Fish and Oyster Commission, which monitored the bays and the Gulf as to what could be harvested. That commission later turned into the Texas Parks and Wildlife Commission, which monitored the bays, the Gulf, and the land. And Caesar became one of the trustees on that game commission. And with science background, they applied hunting seasons and limits to the wildlife that was to be harvested off the land and in the Gulf. And I think it was in 2006 or 7 that the state legislature, they had the state poet, they had the state artist, they had the state singer, and they felt like that the father of conservation, of game conservation, was an important designation. And because of all of Caesar's work dating back to 1900, that he had done the most to conserve and protect wildlife in the state of Texas, and they honored him with a resolution designating him the father of Texas conservation, wildlife conservation in the state. When Caesar passed and left his entire estate for the conservation of wildlife, I'm sure he had no idea that the estate would be of the size it was, because Mrs. King had left him some royalties under King Ranch. And of course, in 1905, 1920, it meant nothing. There was no drilling in South Texas at the time until about 1942, 43, did Humble Oil and Refinery start doing some drilling on King Ranch. And with that, Caesar received some royalties. Those royalties, after Caesar's death in 46, those royalties started amassing. His will was dedicated to wildlife conservation. There were three initial trustees. Was Dr. Poteet from the university, Leroy Denman Sr., and Bob Kleberg Jr. were the original trustees of that foundation. When Leroy Sr. passed, and they appointed Leroy Jr., who was King Ranch's attorney, and then when Dr. Poteet passed, they appointed my father. It was Bob Kleberg, Dick Kleberg Jr., and Leroy Denman. When Robert Kleberg Jr. and Dick Kleberg Jr. passed, they appointed myself, Stephen Kleberg, and Dr. Dwayne Leach. Dwayne was the chancellor of South Texas Systems. At a meeting between Leroy Denman Jr., Dwayne Leach, and myself, Leroy made an observation. He said, the foundation is of significance now, so we need to do something that will benefit wildlife in South Texas, and it too should be of significance. Turned to Dr. Leach and said, Dwayne, we need to have something at the university, in the ag school, that will benefit wildlife in South Texas. Can you go to the dean and have a discussion with him about drafting a proposal that the Caesar Kleberg Foundation can look at? And with that proposal, if it's accepted, we'll fund it with $1.5 million. Dwayne went to Charlie DeYoung, who was the dean of the School of Agriculture at the time, in 1980, and said, Charlie, can you draft a proposal? He said, I think I can. By Monday, he had the proposal ready, and the proposal was to create an applied science institute that would study the wildlife and habitat in South Texas. That proposal was named the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute. And that institute started with Charlie DeYoung, one scientist, and one grant giver, or grant maker, I guess you will. Today, that institute has 17 scientists, a director, development office, and funds receives outside monies that fund the applied research to the tune of about $25 million. So it has grown from an idea that Dwayne and Charlie DeYoung had to an applied science research institute that covers not only just South Texas, but they have research projects in Midland. They have research project in the High Plains with a scientist in Lubbock that's doing work on mule deer and antelope. And probably one of the most far-reaching projects that's been developed was started back in the mid to late 80s, was the native seeds program, where they realized that in order to propagate seeds in different parts of the state, you needed to gather seeds from that particular area, and primarily grass seeds and weed seeds that were good for wildlife. So they started the program in South Texas, Native Seeds Program. They then went to, with the help of Ellen Temple, went to East Texas. They went in Central Texas to Lauren Fisher, and she helped fund that project. Then went to West Texas with the support of Tim Leach, who was with Concho Oil at the time, and developed a program where they could gather and grow seeds in that area and grow an abundance where they could then propagate those seeds in the various areas in which they were gathered. So that's probably the most far-reaching program that the Institute has today, is They call it it was called South Texas Native Seeds, and because it's throughout the state now, they just call it Texas Native Seeds, and they've got seed growers in each one of those areas that grow native seeds, both grass and forb seeds, that to replant highway right-of-ways, energy transmission right-of-ways, oil and gas right-of-ways, where they produce enough seed that they can reseed some of those scarified areas with the native seeds. So it's been a huge success. What I see in the future for ranching 20 years from now, 30 years from now, will be dramatically different. I see it as land-based, and it will not be the focus on cattle and horses as it is today, but it'll be focused on wildlife. And I say that because wildlife is a renewable resource, and if we take care of the land and the plants that are on the land, the wildlife will provide income year-round to these ranching operations. And I don't think, because of the federal tax system that we have today, some of these big ranches will be broken up. I don't think they can afford to stay together. King Ranch is unique, and it's a corporation. But I think many of these properties, look at the 4.6s, it's sold. And I think the next owner of the 4.6s, it'll be 5 or 6 people, not one. And they will be more dependent on wildlife, because you can lease the land for wildlife and you get that every year. Where you get in a drought, you're going to have to get rid of your cows or reduce the numbers dramatically. So I think they'll start thinking about how they can protect and produce wildlife on the land and take place of the cows. So I think that's going to be a change that we'll see 30 years from now that will happen to us, not to King Ranch again, but I think we have made that transition, and that we have a number of lessees that lease for hunting, and that provides stable income to the ranch, another source of income. Birding provides a source of income, but nothing like the hunting does and the wildlife that's involved. Yeah, I don't think the ranches as we know them today, I mean, the 100,000 acre ranches are going to be broken out into 15, 20,000 acres. And when you get them to that size, they're not going to be able to pay the estate taxes when they die. So they're going to be sold. And someone is going to figure out that wildlife is extremely important to that property. I've got a good friend that bought 4.6s, sold 36,000 acres off of their main ranch 5 years ago, divided up into 8,000 acre sections. He had a piece of property in Bastrop County, Elgin, Texas, on the Colorado River. He took about 120 acres and sold it and traded it for 8,000 acres in West Texas. Now go figure. 120 acres for 8,000, and he's got it high fenced, runs a few cattle on it, but the majority of what he has, he's got eland, he's got sable, he's got aoudad, he's probably got 10 different species of wildlife that he realizes that the income he can get from hunting far surpasses anything that he can get for raising cattle. So he's got a few cattle just to keep the grass the way he wants it for his hunting. The hunter is what pays for the conservation. And probably 10 years ago, you had what was known as a livestock exemption for your property, and that you had to have so many head of cattle on a piece of property. Where that's, if you had 20 acres, you had to have 2 head. Or if you had 100 acres, you had to have 3 head. But you could get a wildlife which gave you an ad valorem tax exemption. Law was passed probably 10 years or 15 years ago, where if you had wildlife, your land would qualify as for a wildlife exemption. So you got the same reduction in ad valorem taxes for having wildlife. So that is also helped today in keeping these properties together. Is if you have cattle and or wildlife on them, you got your taxes reduced. So it's made a big impact. No, I would agree with you. And some of these large tracts in South Texas will remain for the next 2 or 3 generations because of the way they're held and the way they're managed. I'm speaking more when you get up into the northern part of the state in North Texas, where they focus primarily on livestock and not on wildlife. They will make that transition. They'll have to if they're going to hold it together and continue to ranch it as a family unit in the years to come. Taylor Sheridan, and he and I think 4 or 5 others. He owns 51%, but he's got to keep writing too, because he's got a contract with Paramount, and if he doesn't keep writing, he doesn't get his contract fulfilled, and he doesn't have the money to keep paying for the 4/6s. So he's got a huge motivating factor to continue, and he is an incredibly intelligent. How you could have 4 programs going on at the same time and writing for each one of them. Well, I'll give you 3 examples. One of the blocks in North Texas that was part of the 4/6s was sold to an artist. He wanted a place where he could sit out in West Texas and look at the open spaces. He was a Western artist and could do his work and not be bothered. Put a house out there and he got a beautiful studio, but nobody around him. No airplanes, no car traffic, nothing. And put exotic game on it, because he wanted to see exotic game and probably used it in some of his art form and in some of his work. Another piece that was sold for the fellow from Elgin, he had cattle and had a place in West Texas, so he was a rancher. He knew what he was going to do before he bought it and what he wanted to do with it and how he wanted to characterize it. And then you go to the extreme example of Taylor. Taylor knew nothing about ranching. In my estimation, he knew a lot about horses, and he bought a piece of property that had really good management on it, and if he will listen to the management, he will be successful. Mm-hmm. But he knows horses, so he can put his effort and experience into improving the horses, and leave the cattle breeding and the cattle rearing and all of that to the management that's in place. That project, I think, is exactly what's motivated Jay Kleberg to take on, bring the different disciplines together, because they're not talking to each other. And is the applied science that one's doing and the other one, is there any crossover? Hart Institute's been there for probably 15 years now, 10 years at least. The fellow that founded it was the editor and publisher of the Corpus Christi Caller, and he left his estate, part of it, to establish this Marine Science Institute. And they, matter of fact, the director of the institute, David Yoskowitz, and I don't know if David probably been there 8 years anyway. When Carter Smith, who was head of Parks and Wildlife, retired, they went and stole David Yoskowitz from the Hart Institute to run Texas Parks and Wildlife. And David and Jay Kleberg had been working together, so David had visions of this collaborative effort of all of these scientists that are working on various projects on the bays and the Gulf come together and solve one big problem: how to keep the bay and estuaries healthy. So when David goes to Austin, Jay falls right in and says, well, we need to bring these, we can't just let it stop there. And so David had told Jay all of the different people that he'd been in contact with when he was at Hart Institute. So Jay said, well, I need to get all those people at the table. And that's a consortium that's come together to create the Gulf of Mexico Trust. And they've got work to do, but at least they've got a platform. He and Ben Masters have done 2 films already. One was called Deep in the Heart, and it took all of the wildlife, or the major species of wildlife, starting in North Texas, the antelope, the mule deer, and their area of habitat. Then it came on down to Paladero Canyon, south of Amarillo, and filmed the buffalo, the bison. Moved into Lubbock and central Texas area and filmed mule deer, the cranes in that area. Moved on south into West Texas, filmed black bear, antelope, mule deer, and elk. Came down to Guadalupe and highlighted the Guadalupe bass that goes from about San Marcos on out into the Gulf. Came to Laredo and did white-tailed deer and blue quail. Migrated on into South Texas, did white-tailed deer, Rio Grande turkey, bobwhite quail, and followed the watershed on out into the Gulf. But that one film, Deep in the Heart, really focused on the game in Texas, the native game that was in the state of Texas. They undertook another one talking about the border wall between Texas and Mexico. They put in kayaks there and came from Santa Elena Canyon on to Laredo and down the Rio Grande to the Gulf of Mexico to Boca Chica, and that took them 2 months. But there's no way that you will ever experience the state of Texas on the Rio Grande like you will by looking at that film. You couldn't do it. You may do it in a helicopter, but you'd never experience like they did by literally traversing that entire length over 90 days or 60 days and seeing the flow of the Rio Grande and areas when it got to Lake Amistad, just west of Laredo and Del Rio, where it was dammed up. And a lot of that water from the Colorado that came into the Rio Grande goes into Mexico, because that's part of the sharing experience, or the agreement between Texas and Mexico, that they would share in that volume of water that came down the Rio Grande. Jay's going to work with Ben on another project called River in the Wall 2. No, excuse me, Deep in the Heart 2. Ben did, along with Jay, did Deep in the Heart 1. Deep in the Heart 2 is going to take the major rivers in the state of Texas and follow those from their beginning all the way to the coastline of Texas, where they come out into a bay or into the Gulf of Mexico, whichever. Like the Rio Grande. Rio Grande starts in Colorado, comes down through Texas near El Paso, Elephant Butte, comes all the way down Del Rio, Laredo, McAllen, and finally gets in the Gulf of Mexico at Boca Chica. It's probably the longest of the rivers that affect Texas, but he's going to be doing the Nueces River, and follow it to Guadalupe. But he'll be doing each river that comes through the state of Texas, following it all the way to where it merges with the either a bay or the Gulf of Mexico, and that's deep in the heart too. I think one of the pristine waterways in the state of Texas is in West Texas, and that's Devil's River. It has a unique history about it. Where it's farmed, it's in very, very arid part of the state, and it's actually a beautiful repository of water that rainwater that comes in, and actually a flowing spring that starts, and very important in that the wildlife that gather around it. It's got a lot of pictorial art graph that the native Indians left there after they left that area of the state. But it's you can kayak down it for a certain length, and I don't know what that is, whether that's 10 miles or 20 miles, but beautiful, pristine, clear water. That there's some concern today about all of the wind factories going in, and are they going to affect ultimately that pristine spring and affect its ability to exist in the state. Jay Kleberg and his wife, Chrissy, think that there's an important message to be told about the bays along the Texas coast and the Gulf of Mexico, and the importance of those bays and the barrier islands. They're going to start filming in October. They're going to walk the 7 barrier islands, starting with, I think, around Bay City, and start and walk all the way down to Brownsville. That's going to take them about 2 to 3 weeks. They're going to film along the way and talk about the importance of each one of those islands to the bay that's behind it and the wildlife that's in the bay and on the island. I do know that around Galveston they filmed the Red Wolf, which is very uniquely suited to that particular barrier island. They're going to do the whooping cranes as they come down to St. Joe. They're going to do redhead ducks when they get into the lower Laguna, into Laguna Madre. So they're going to be following that shoreline of the 7 bays, or the 7 spoil islands, I guess, or not spoil islands, they're natural islands, but they do act as a refuge to the landfill. But they're going to do the whole walk and produce a film about that trip. So it ought to be very educating, focusing on the natural and conservation along what people have done to preserve those islands.